In the roaring 1920s, Chicago was a city on the edge. Violence, power struggles, and the illegal liquor trade dominated the streets, and one name loomed over all: Al Capone. Known for his ruthless tactics and strategic mind, Capone's empire was built not just on fear, but on meticulous planning and calculated moves. Among the most notorious events in his criminal career was the infamous massacre at a garage on Valentine's Day, a night that would cement his reputation as one of the most feared gangsters in American history. Today, we'll dive deep into that night, exploring every detail: the tension, the planning, the players involved, and the aftermath that changed the Chicago underworld forever. This is a story of betrayal, power, and one man's unrelenting control over a city gripped by crime. The date was February 14, 1929. In a quiet industrial neighborhood in Chicago, a seemingly ordinary garage became the site of one of the bloodiest chapters in the city's history. Known later simply as the Valentine's Day Massacre, the event was not random. It was the climax of months of tension between rival gangs, with Capone at the center. Capone's rise in Chicago had not been smooth. The illegal liquor trade during Prohibition had created enormous wealth, but also fierce competition. The North Side Gang, led by George "Bugs" Moran, posed the biggest threat to Capone's dominance. Moran had resisted Capone's efforts to absorb or intimidate his operations, and their rivalry had escalated to a point where confrontation was inevitable. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, Capone carefully monitored Moran's movements, gathering intelligence on his allies, routines, and vulnerabilities. Unlike his earlier violent encounters that were often spontaneous, this operation required precision, planning, and psychological insight. Every detail mattered, from the timing to the vehicles used, from the disguises to the positioning of shooters. On that fateful morning, the weather in Chicago was cold and gray, a typical February day. But inside the garage at 2122 North Clark Street, the tension was far from the mundane chill outside. Moran and several members of his gang were unaware that they were walking into a trap. They arrived expecting a meeting with unknown allies, a potential negotiation, but what awaited them was meticulously orchestrated death. Capone's men, some disguised as police officers, lined up along the walls, weapons ready. Their presence was carefully calculated, enough to instill confidence that they were law enforcement, yet capable of unleashing deadly force within moments. The garage itself, with its limited exits and enclosed space, was the perfect stage for an ambush. As Moran and his associates entered, they were greeted by the false authority of the impersonators, not realizing that this was a ruse designed to neutralize them instantly. Capone had chosen his shooters based on loyalty, efficiency, and experience. Each man knew his role, the positions he needed to cover, and the targets he was responsible for. This operation, chilling in its execution, reflected Capone's cold, strategic mind. Within minutes, the garage turned from a quiet space into a scene of chaos. Guns fired in rapid succession. 7 men fell to the ground, each struck by multiple bullets. The air was filled with the smoke of gunfire and the echoes of violence. The precision with which Capone's men carried out the attack stunned even seasoned observers in Chicago. There was no hesitation, no misfires, only the calculated culmination of months of planning. Witnesses outside the garage would later describe the scene as surreal and horrifying. Police arriving shortly after found the bodies sprawled across the floor, some of the men still clutching weapons, a testament to the brief but lethal struggle that had taken place. Newspapers would soon capture the event in bold headlines, and the massacre became a symbol not only of Capone's ruthlessness but also of the escalating gang warfare gripping Chicago. The massacre sent shockwaves throughout the city. Moran survived by sheer luck, arriving late and avoiding the ambush entirely, but the message was clear: Capone controlled the streets, and any opposition would face overwhelming consequences. The balance of power in Chicago's underworld had shifted dramatically that day, with Capone emerging as the undisputed force behind the liquor empire. The massacre at 2122 North Clark Street had sent shockwaves not only through Chicago but across the United States. By the time news of the bloodshed spread, the city was gripped by fear and speculation. Headlines screamed of gang warfare, police inefficiency, and the growing power of Al Capone. Yet for Capone himself, the operation was not just a display of violence, it was a carefully calculated move to consolidate power and eliminate his most persistent rival. Inside the North Side, George "Bugs" Moran was shaken to the core. Only by sheer coincidence had he avoided the ambush, arriving late due to a car breakdown. As he processed the loss of his closest men, Moran understood that the streets of Chicago had shifted irrevocably. The North Side Gang, once a dominant force, now faced a strategic and psychological blow that undermined morale and trust within its ranks. Members questioned each other, wondering who might be compromised or working as informants. Meanwhile, Capone's lieutenants, including Jack McGurn and Albert Anselmi, ensured that the operation was covered by an intricate network of loyal watchers who reported any immediate retaliation attempts. Capone understood that eliminating Moran's allies was not enough. The mere perception of his reach needed to be imprinted in every gangster's mind. Every bar, warehouse, and speakeasy became a reminder that opposing Capone could be fatal. The city itself became a theater of tension. Business owners, policemen, and ordinary citizens observed a chilling reality. Gang violence had escalated to new heights, and even law enforcement seemed powerless to stop it. The massacre marked a turning point in how organized crime operated in Chicago. Capone's enemies no longer debated whether to confront him, they weighed the deadly consequences. For the media, the massacre was a sensational story. Newspapers rushed to report the event, often exaggerating details, yet the core fact remained indisputable: 7 men dead, execution style, with precision that stunned the public. Photographs of the crime scene, showing bodies sprawled and windows shattered, became iconic, leaving readers with a permanent image of the ruthlessness of gang warfare. Reporters tried to connect the dots, linking Capone to the killings, but the gangster remained carefully insulated, miles away in Miami at the time, attending meetings with government officials and maintaining the facade of a legitimate businessman. Capone's strategy went beyond the massacre itself. By staying away from the scene, he avoided direct implication while sending a clear message: his power extended across state lines, and no one could reach him without consequences. This duality, extreme violence executed by his men on the streets, and personal invisibility in public affairs, was a hallmark of his operational genius. In the days following the massacre, the underworld responded. Rival gangs held emergency meetings to assess Capone's strength. Some chose temporary alliances, others reconsidered their territories, and a few plotted in secret. Yet despite their best efforts, Capone's control over Chicago's illegal liquor market had grown stronger. The massacre, intended to break Moran's resistance, had done more than that. It had solidified Capone's image as a calculating, fearless leader. Police investigations began, but progress was slow. Eyewitnesses were scarce, intimidated, or unwilling to speak. Evidence was limited, and the perpetrators had carefully planned their exit routes. Even with modern investigative tools, the crime would have posed a challenge. In 1929, it was nearly impossible to pin the massacre directly on Capone. This allowed him to maintain both fear and plausible deniability, a combination that made him untouchable in the public eye. By the end of the week, Chicago had transformed. The streets whispered the name of Capone with a mixture of fear and awe. Bars, clubs, and speakeasies were now under silent observation. Even neutral parties, the delivery men, bartenders, and small-time operators, understood that the North Side Massacre was a turning point. The message was clear: Chicago belonged to Al Capone. Political shadows in the empire's grip. After the shocking massacre, Al Capone's influence extended far beyond the alleys of Chicago. While ordinary citizens recoiled in horror, many politicians, law enforcement officers, and business elites began to recognize the undeniable power Capone wielded. He was no longer merely a gangster, he had become a figure whose reach penetrated both the criminal underworld and legitimate society. Capone understood that true dominance required more than violence, it demanded influence. He cultivated relationships with corrupt city officials, police officers, and even judges, ensuring that his operations were shielded from legal repercussions. During this period, his agents circulated through City Hall, observing legislation and quietly bribing key figures to safeguard speakeasies, breweries, and gambling dens. Capone's ability to blend brutality with political maneuvering made him untouchable. The massacre had sent ripples through the American public as well. Newspapers across the nation covered the story, often sensationalizing the bloodshed while failing to directly implicate Capone. Editorials debated the rise of organized crime, yet many readers remained fascinated by the audacity and meticulous planning behind the killings. The public perception of Capone became a mix of fear, disgust, and reluctant admiration. In homes, offices, and bars, his name was spoken with a hushed reverence, a reminder that one man could dominate a city through both terror and strategy. Within the criminal network, Capone solidified his command. Key lieutenants such as Jack McGurn, Frank Rio, and Albert Anselmi expanded operations, supervising extortion, bootlegging, and enforcement activities. Every North Side rivals movement was tracked meticulously, and intelligence networks ensured that potential threats were neutralized before they could escalate. Capone's style was preventive as much as punitive. He struck with precision when necessary but also maintained a constant atmosphere of control and vigilance. Meanwhile, law enforcement faced mounting pressure from the public and political leaders. Despite the magnitude of the crime, arrests were minimal, and no one could definitively link the massacre to Capone. Investigators struggled to piece together evidence, hampered by witnesses too frightened to come forward and a criminal machine that operated with near-military precision. This cloak of invincibility further enhanced Capone's reputation, reinforcing the perception that opposing him was both futile and dangerous. The massacre also altered the dynamics of Chicago's gangland alliances. Some smaller factions sought to ally with Capone, recognizing that survival depended on association with his empire. Others attempted secretive resistance, but these efforts were quickly stifled, often through intimidation or swift violent response. Within months, the Chicago outfit had consolidated control over nearly all lucrative territories in the city, including liquor distribution, gambling, and protection rackets. Capone's personal life during this period was also carefully curated to maintain the appearance of legitimacy. Publicly, he attended social events, philanthropic functions, and meetings with politicians, all while continuing to direct a sprawling criminal empire from behind the scenes. This dual identity, the urbane businessman and the ruthless mob boss, was a critical factor in his enduring influence. The Valentine's Day Massacre had thus achieved far more than the elimination of rivals. It sent a psychological shockwave that reshaped the balance of power in Chicago. Citizens, gangsters, and authorities alike were forced to reckon with a single truth: Capone's empire was vast, his strategy complex, and his dominance nearly absolute. He had transformed a violent act into a tool of political, social, and criminal leverage, demonstrating that in the world of organized crime, perception could be as lethal as bullets. As winter turned into spring, the streets of Chicago remained tense. The massacre was no longer merely a story of a single violent night, it had become the foundation of Capone's legend, cementing his image as a man whose combination of fear, strategy, and influence extended into every corner of the city and beyond. His network grew stronger, more disciplined, and more terrifying, signaling that the era of open confrontation with the North Side Gang was definitively over, and a new age of Capone's control had begun. Strategy, internal tensions, and the law. Following the massacre, Al Capone's empire faced a new set of challenges. The audacity of the killings had cemented his dominance, yet the streets of Chicago were never entirely peaceful. Internal tensions simmered within the outfit itself. Lieutenants and ambitious members often jostled for power, seeking to control lucrative territories or gain favor with Capone. Maintaining discipline required a delicate balance of fear, reward, and strategic oversight. Capone relied on a combination of loyalty tests, calculated rewards, and occasional punishment to ensure that his men remained obedient. Jack McGurn, his trusted hitman and right-hand enforcer, played a crucial role in monitoring potential dissenters. Any sign of disloyalty was immediately addressed, not always with bullets, but often through intimidation and public humiliation, reinforcing the chain of command. Capone understood that a single act of betrayal within his organization could unravel months of careful planning. Externally, rival gangs were hesitant but not idle. The North Side remnants, though severely weakened, attempted covert acts of retaliation. Capone's intelligence network, however, intercepted almost every movement before it could escalate. His spies, informants, and strategically placed allies in bars, clubs, and speakeasies functioned as the eyes and ears of the outfit, ensuring that threats could be neutralized silently and efficiently. Every action, from a whispered conversation to a small street-level attack, was monitored and addressed with precision. The law enforcement response added another layer of complexity. Federal agents in the Chicago Police Department faced immense pressure from the public and politicians to bring Capone to justice. Yet despite their efforts, he remained largely untouchable. Capone had cultivated relationships with key officials, ensured that witnesses were too intimidated to testify, and maintained operations in a way that minimized direct exposure to himself. Investigators found that linking him to any specific crime required evidence that was almost impossible to gather. Capone also expanded his strategic approach to business fronts. Legitimate-looking operations, restaurants, nightclubs, and even newspapers, allowed him to launder money, project influence, and maintain a public image of respectability. These fronts acted as buffers between his criminal activities and law enforcement scrutiny. While the city's headlines screamed of violence, Capone was calculating every step, preparing for a long-term consolidation of power. The massacre had a psychological impact beyond the city. Rival gang leaders in neighboring states took notice. They realized that challenging Capone's authority was not only risky but often fatal. This fear factor allowed Capone to negotiate deals, acquire territories, and maintain near-total control over Chicago's illicit markets. His network became a sophisticated criminal enterprise, blending intimidation with negotiation, and violence with calculated diplomacy. Despite his growing power, Capone remained vigilant. Every public appearance was measured, every meeting scrutinized for potential threats, and every alliance monitored for loyalty. His empire was not just built on fear, it was maintained by an intricate understanding of human behavior, strategic foresight, and relentless control. The city of Chicago itself became a stage for Capone's calculated power. Neighborhoods, speakeasies, and alleys were no longer merely locations, they were chessboard pieces, each move carefully considered. By mastering the interplay of internal control, rival intimidation, and law enforcement manipulation, Capone demonstrated that organized crime was not chaos, it was a business. With him as the CEO, strategist, and ultimate authority. The Valentine's Day Massacre was far more than a violent event, it was a turning point that revealed the depth of Capone's strategy, the discipline of his organization, and his ability to operate above the law. The massacre's shockwaves continued to shape alliances, rivalries, and the public perception of organized crime for years to come. As Chicago adjusted to a new era of Capone's dominance, the city's underworld had learned a fundamental truth. In the game of organized crime, every decision, every relationship, and every act of violence must be meticulously calculated, or it could spell disaster. And Al Capone was a master of that calculation. Aftermath, fear, and the inevitable decline. In the cold winter of February 1929, Chicago woke up to smoke-filled streets, shattered windows, and the chilling aftermath of the Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 bodies lay in a Lincoln Park garage, each a stark reminder of Al Capone's ability to dictate life and death without ever showing up personally. News spread rapidly, capturing the nation's attention, shocking ordinary citizens, and creating a legend around the name Capone. But behind the headlines, a complex interplay of fear, strategy, and vulnerability began to unfold. Capone, aware that public and law enforcement scrutiny had reached unprecedented levels, intensified his security. His 3.5-ton armored Cadillac became his constant companion, its bulletproof windows and reinforced body protecting him from potential assassination attempts. Every public appearance was meticulously planned. Even in his offices, every guest, every conversation, and every meeting was subject to careful observation by his trusted lieutenants. Capone knew that one wrong move could cost him everything he had built. While the massacre consolidated his dominance, it also increased the pressure from law enforcement. The police, the FBI, and federal agents were under relentless scrutiny to act against Capone. Investigations intensified, raids became more frequent, and witnesses grew increasingly cautious, or disappeared entirely. Capone's empire, though vast and fearsome, required constant vigilance to operate smoothly. Every shipment of alcohol, every gambling operation, and every financial transaction was shadowed by the threat of federal intervention. Internally, Capone continued to manage his lieutenants with precision. Loyalty was everything. The Capone Code was clear: obedience, discretion, and discipline. Jack McGurn, Frank Nitti, and other key figures ensured that the gang's operations ran like clockwork. Any hint of betrayal was met with swift retribution, reinforcing the culture of fear and respect. The organization became a model of efficiency: criminality as business, violence as a tool, and loyalty as currency. Despite his control, Capone was not invincible. Rival gangs were weakened but still existed, plotting quietly, waiting for an opportunity to exploit mistakes. Political figures and law enforcement, though often compromised by corruption, were relentless in documenting Capone's every move. The man who once ruled the streets of Chicago with impunity now found himself navigating a complex maze of public outrage, political pressure, and media scrutiny. The psychological weight of his position began to show. Capone's persona of invincibility was carefully maintained in public, but private accounts suggest he carried the constant stress of potential exposure, betrayal, and assassination. He became increasingly reclusive, surrounding himself with trusted bodyguards, and limiting personal interactions. Even close allies rarely saw the real man behind the legend, a man whose brilliance in organization was matched only by his paranoia. Financial scrutiny became Capone's most dangerous opponent. The government's focus shifted from the violent crimes he orchestrated to tax evasion, a realm where his meticulous avoidance of conventional banking and documentation became a double-edged sword. Capone had never signed checks, opened bank accounts, or formally registered property in his name. Yet, the Internal Revenue Service methodically built a case, knowing that even a single miscalculation could lead to his downfall. The months following the massacre were marked by a tense balance. Capone had achieved a peak of fear and influence, yet the pressure from law enforcement and the threat of internal betrayal never ceased. His empire was at once invincible and fragile, a paradox of organized crime. Chicago had learned to respect and fear him, but the forces arrayed against him were steadily closing in. Ultimately, the Valentine's Day Massacre was not just a story of violence, it was a defining moment in Capone's life and career. It demonstrated his ruthlessness, his strategic genius, and his ability to command loyalty through fear and respect. It also marked the beginning of heightened scrutiny, paving the way for legal strategies that would eventually bring him down. The massacre ensured that his name would be etched in American history as the epitome of organized crime, powerful, terrifying, and yet, ultimately vulnerable to the persistent reach of the law. As the city recovered, the memory of that cold February morning lingered. The streets of Chicago remained a theater of both fear and admiration. Al Capone's legend had been forged not just by bullets and violence, but by an extraordinary understanding of strategy, psychology, and human behavior. The story of the Valentine's Day Massacre, and the subsequent consolidation of power, stands as a chilling testament to a man who could orchestrate death from afar, command absolute loyalty, and instill terror while remaining untouchable, at least for a time. By the end of 1929, Al Capone was both feared and scrutinized more than ever. He had cemented his place as Chicago's most notorious gangster, but the seeds of his eventual decline, legal battles, tax investigations, and internal pressures, were quietly taking root. The massacre, the Cadillac, the strategic meetings, and the empire built on loyalty and fear all pointed to one truth: power was never absolute, and in the world of organized crime, even the most untouchable kingpin must navigate the fine line between dominance and disaster.